June 10, 1944 began with a discovery no army expected. In a village barely retaken hours earlier, smoke still drifted from collapsed stone walls as a British intelligence team moved through the ruins, checking for anything the retreating Germans left behind. Inside a half-burned command post, a corporal kicked aside ash and found a steel map case lying untouched beside a fallen radio operator. The leather straps were scorched, but the lock had melted open. When Major Lawrence Ashford lifted the lid, he froze. Inside were fresh field orders, artillery timetables, and the complete operational plan for German units scheduled to counterattack within the next 72 hours. Each page carried signatures, stamps, and grid references so exact they could only have been issued hours before the retreat. The building was silent except for the ticking of a warped clock, but the meaning was immediate and immense. In a single moment, the entire enemy intention for this sector had been exposed. And as the Major realized, this was not the first time such papers had tilted a battlefield, only the latest in a hidden war fought through documents scattered across collapsing fronts. By the middle years of the war, every major command understood that battles were no longer decided only by tanks, shells, or aircraft, but by the quiet movement of information, maps tucked in tunics, orders folded inside dispatch riders' bags, code sheets clipped to radios. The European battlefield produced more paperwork than any conflict before it, because the gigantic machinery of total war demanded exact schedules, supply forecasts, and movement tables to keep entire armies functioning. German formations, following strict doctrine, relied on detailed written instructions issued down to battalion level. Allied forces, with vast multinational coordination, operated through thick packets of orders prepared at field headquarters. And the Soviet army, spanning thousands of miles of front, depended on written directives flown between command posts or pushed along perilous road networks. These documents were never meant to survive a retreat. Every officer carried burning tablets, lighters, or pre-mixed incendiary tubes precisely for the moment when withdrawal became unavoidable. Yet combat rarely followed the plans written on paper. Positions collapsed faster than expected. Command posts came under sudden artillery fire. Patrols broke through lines earlier than anticipated. In those narrow windows, minutes, sometimes seconds, documents meant for flames instead fell into enemy hands. At the start of the war in Poland, British and French observers already noted how often German units abandoned map cases during rapid advances. In France 1940, German forward units captured entire French staff cars loaded with planning folders for sectors that had not yet fallen. But the reverse also happened. During the fighting around Arras, British teams found intact German radio schedules, revealing how quickly panzer divisions intended to pivot south. None of these discoveries won battles outright, but they showed a shift underway. Commanders began to realize that a single bundle of papers could expose the inner logic of an entire offensive. The early desert campaigns pushed this reality even further. In North Africa, where distances were vast and units spread thin, every order had to be written, carried, and redistributed. Patrol actions frequently ended with officers killed before they could destroy their files. In one 1941 incident, British soldiers discovered supply allocation tables inside a captured Italian vehicle, allowing analysts to estimate how much fuel Axis forces had left. Rommel's Afrika Korps struggled constantly with paper discipline, especially during rapid withdrawals when burning materials became physically impossible. The sand, the wind, the sudden arrival of enemy armored cars, all created moments when well-protected command posts turned into sources of intelligence gold. Analysts in Cairo and London began assembling entire patterns of enemy movement from scraps collected on the battlefield. Wounded couriers carrying half-destroyed notes, collapsed headquarters with untouched drawers, or even metal document tubes buried hastily in shallow trenches. By 1942, both sides recognized the escalating stakes. German counterintelligence issued stricter protocols. Officers were forbidden from carrying sensitive maps near the front. Divisional command posts were ordered to maintain burn pits manned around the clock, and new regulations required the shredding of obsolete orders within hours. But reality was crueler than regulations. A single artillery bombardment could scatter papers across a field. A sniper's bullet could drop an officer before he lit the fuse on his destruction kit. Snow, mud, fire, and collapsing buildings disrupted well-rehearsed procedures. On the Eastern Front, where entire regiments dissolved in sudden encirclements, the Soviet army captured planning folders revealing not just tactical deployments, but the very assumptions under which German commanders operated. At Stalingrad, Soviet intelligence recovered notebooks from staff officers listing casualty projections, resupply expectations, and fallback lines, documents never intended for enemy study. The Western Allies faced similar challenges in safeguarding their own papers. American units entering Tunisia in late 1942 carried enormous amounts of documentation, and several setbacks exposed field orders during chaotic withdrawals. Commanders learned through painful experience that a misplaced briefcase might reveal artillery positions, ammunition shortages, or even identity of units freshly arrived in theater. Intelligence officers began traveling with frontline troops not only to gather material, but to educate commanders on the growing intelligence war unfolding in the shadows of conventional battlefields. As each month passed, the race intensified. Analysts discovered that captured documents did not simply reveal numbers or positions, they revealed thinking. They exposed which commanders were cautious or aggressive, which divisions were exhausted, which sectors' headquarters believed were stable or fragile. They showed what enemy staff feared most. And as the war deepened, both sides realized the uncomfortable truth. A retreat measured in minutes could determine whether an entire operation remained secret or became transparent to the enemy. This rising tension, between careful planning and chaotic battlefield reality, would define the next stage of the conflict, when document captures began shaping not just isolated engagements but the direction of entire fronts. By 1942, the struggle for documents had become a parallel war, quiet, relentless, and increasingly decisive. Every major front produced new examples that showed how even disciplined armies could not fully control the chaos surrounding their retreats. In North Africa, as Allied pressure tightened after the Second Battle of El Alamein, German and Italian units attempted to pull back in good order, yet the speed of the withdrawal often outran their ability to burn records. British patrols advancing along the coastal road found discarded map boards at abandoned checkpoints, telephone logs inside overturned staff cars, and even complete engineering plans for fortifications that had been started but never finished. These papers, rushed into intelligence tents only hours after capture, revealed the scale of Axis supply shortages more clearly than any intercepted radio message. Analysts in Cairo used these discoveries to calculate the shrinking operational radius of Rommel's armored units and to predict where he would attempt to stabilize his line. The documents did not provide victory alone, but they sharpened every decision, from reconnaissance flights to convoy movements, making each Allied action more precise. In the Soviet Union, the winter of 1942-43 produced an even larger harvest of information. German formations, trapped between shifting fronts, often lost their headquarters in sudden assaults or encirclements. When Soviet units broke into German positions during the Stalingrad fighting, they frequently found registers listing casualties, ammunition states, and the morale reports filed by junior officers. These were not glamorous documents, but they revealed strain, exhaustion, and the growing mismatch between orders issued from high command and conditions on the ground. Soviet intelligence officers learned, for example, how long German battalions could sustain themselves before requiring reinforcement, and which units were forced to rotate men more frequently due to combat stress. This granular insight helped Soviet commanders anticipate where gaps would appear after prolonged fighting. The Red Army also uncovered fragments of operational studies prepared months earlier, showing how German planners had underestimated the logistical demands of the Eastern Campaign. While individual papers varied in importance, together they formed a mosaic of the enemy's crumbling confidence. The collapse of Italy in 1943 opened an entirely different door. When the Italian government signed the armistice in September, German forces raced to seize weapons, vehicles, and territory, yet their haste also exposed hundreds of administrative centers and garrisons. Allied troops advancing through southern Italy found intact registry rooms filled with German liaison reports, transportation schedules, and diplomatic cables that had been stored but never evacuated. Some Italian units, unsure of their next move, surrendered with their paperwork untouched, handing Allied analysts an extraordinary view of German intentions across the Mediterranean. Among the more valuable finds were naval coordination charts outlining U-boat support points near Greek islands and high-level correspondence describing German expectations for future Allied landings. These documents allowed planners in London and Washington to refine deception operations, shaping the Mediterranean campaign in ways the Germans failed to anticipate. Air operations contributed their own stream of discoveries. Shot-down aircraft sometimes carried navigational sheets, coded frequency lists, or lists of alternative landing fields. During raids on German airfields in France and the Low Countries, Allied commandos seized briefing folders minutes before German personnel could ignite burn barrels. Some of these papers included flight altitude profiles, bomber routing predictions, or radar interference instructions, material that helped Allied engineers adjust their countermeasures. In one instance, a German Ju-88 crash-landed with its wireless operator killed instantly, leaving behind a satchel containing updated cipher tables for local communications. Although the tables could not break Enigma, they aided British codebreakers in narrowing which frequencies were being used for frontline coordination. By late 1943, the accumulated effect of these captures was unmistakable. Allied intelligence no longer viewed documents as occasional bonuses, but as a central pillar of operational planning. Dedicated teams were deployed specifically to exploit abandoned headquarters, examine destroyed vehicles, and search the belongings of captured officers. Analysts learned to identify the significance of seemingly mundane items. A fuel requisition note could hint at an impending armored thrust. A list of rations could reveal the anticipated duration of a defensive stand. A repair log could signal that a division was failing to maintain its vehicles. Meanwhile, German leadership grew increasingly frustrated as reports showed the repeated loss of sensitive material. New regulations limited what junior officers could carry, but the demands of a vast front required the constant movement of orders. The more the war turned against Germany, the more hurried their withdrawals became, and the more documents fell into enemy hands. This rising tide of captured intelligence set the stage for the most consequential discoveries of the war, moments when entire operational plans, not just fragments, were suddenly exposed. And as the conflict approached its decisive phase in 1944, both sides understood that one intact folder seized at the right moment could shift the logic of an entire battlefield. The closer the war moved to its final years, the more the struggle for captured documents revealed its deeply human dimension. Frontline troops who were trained to seize trenches or clear buildings found themselves performing tasks normally reserved for intelligence officers, because the opportunity to secure papers often lasted only moments. Scouts crawling through fog or rubble sometimes discovered an enemy dispatch rider lying beside a crashed motorcycle, his leather satchel still sealed. Infantrymen breaking into a bunker during a night attack might find a desk drawer open, a stack of typed orders half pulled out as the previous occupants fled in haste. These discoveries were rarely dramatic. They happened amid confusion, smoke, and exhaustion, often as a secondary concern during life-and-death fighting. Yet the emotional weight of these finds was unmistakable. Soldiers recognized that the papers they picked up, sometimes with dirt still clinging to them, could determine which units lived or died in the coming days. Many veterans later recalled the eerie quiet that followed such moments, when gunfire receded just long enough for them to understand that the battlefield had yielded something more valuable than any weapon. Beyond the human level, the tactical implications of captured documents were enormous, because they transformed how commanders interpreted the terrain around them. A single map annotated with pencil markings could show exactly where an enemy intended to place artillery batteries or anti-tank guns. An operations order with timing tables could reveal the schedule of an attack before the first shot was fired. In Tunisia, Allied commanders used captured German construction diagrams to anticipate where minefields had been laid, allowing engineers to clear lanes faster and with fewer casualties. During the Normandy campaign, British units occasionally uncovered lists of fallback positions, enabling them to bypass strong points and cut off retreating forces before they reorganized. These tactical advantages multiplied rapidly. Once analysts combined a captured sketch or order with reconnaissance photos or decrypted messages, patterns emerged that were invisible before. Commanders could see which roads the enemy relied on, which regiments were being rotated, which companies were under strength, and which sectors the enemy believed were vulnerable. On several occasions, the timing of Allied offensives shifted by hours or even minutes, because a retrieved folder clarified the window before a German counterattack could be organized. Even small errors in German paperwork, incorrect grid references or rushed handwriting, helped analysts map enemy confusion, allowing Allied staff to predict where pressure would break resistance. Tactical intelligence gained from these captures did not merely sharpen decisions, it reshaped the tempo of operations, enabling Allied forces to maintain momentum at critical stages of the war. The technological angle of captured documents was equally significant, especially as the conflict became more mechanized and communications grew more complex. Although Allied cryptanalysts had made breakthrough progress in signals intelligence, physical codebooks, call sign lists, and radio frequency tables, remained essential pieces of the puzzle. A decrypted message could indicate content, but without the corresponding documents found in crashed aircraft or abandoned posts, analysts sometimes struggled to determine which units were transmitting or how often frequencies changed. When Allied teams seized cipher material from downed German aircraft in France, they gained insight into how quickly Luftwaffe squadrons rotated their communication protocols, which improved the accuracy of radar plotting and early warning systems. In the Mediterranean, British naval forces used captured coastal defense manuals to understand how German shore batteries coordinated their fire across multiple observation posts. This allowed Allied ships to maneuver through narrow straits with a far better understanding of where the heaviest concentrations of guns were located. In Eastern Europe, Soviet intelligence units recovered engineering notes from abandoned German vehicles that detailed repair priorities for armored divisions, revealing the strain on spare parts and maintenance networks. These scraps of information were not theoretical, they directly influenced how armies conducted battle. A wireless operator with the right frequency list could intercept enemy traffic within minutes. A tank commander who understood how enemy armor struggled with overheating could time attacks for maximum disruption. A naval planner with access to enemy coastal defense charts could route convoys through safer corridors. And every time such documents were captured, they exposed the delicate balance between planning and improvisation upon which modern armies depended. All these angles, human courage, tactical insight, and technological decoding, interlocked into a pattern that defined the intelligence war of 1943-44. The battlefield no longer yielded only prisoners or equipment, it offered glimpses into the enemy's thinking, fears, and assumptions. Each captured page, no matter how mundane, became a thread that analysts could pull to unravel much larger designs. As the fronts narrowed and the pace of operations accelerated, the importance of this hidden competition grew sharper. Commanders on both sides understood that the next major breakthrough might not begin with artillery fire or armored thrusts, but with a single case of documents discovered in a quiet room moments after its occupants fled. Leadership decisions often revealed the full power of captured documents, because generals understood that information could tilt entire operations more quickly than reinforcements or equipment. Commanders like Bernard Montgomery, Dwight Eisenhower, and Konstantin Rokossovsky relied heavily on their intelligence staff to extract meaning from the papers brought in by frontline troops. Montgomery, cautious yet methodical, often halted planned movements for hours if new documents implied undiscovered enemy capabilities along his axis of advance. Eisenhower, overseeing multinational armies, depended on captured German orders to anticipate where local commanders might attempt counterattacks or concentrate armor. Rokossovsky, fighting under punishing conditions on the Eastern Front, used captured German assessments of Soviet units to identify where the enemy believed his armies were weakest, and turned those moments of enemy confidence into opportunities for surprise offensives. These decisions were not guesses, they were rooted in the uncomfortable truth that enemy commanders often revealed far more on paper than they intended. Behind every folder delivered to a field headquarters was a chain of decisions influenced by fear, uncertainty, and tempo. Leaders knew that acting on captured information too quickly risked alerting the enemy to their loss, while waiting too long risked missing the advantage. The finest commanders learned to interpret not only what the documents said, but what their existence implied. Confusion in enemy staff work, disagreement among officers, or desperation reflected in rushed handwriting and revised orders. For the Germans, the loss of documents became a recurring vulnerability, one tied deeply to their own doctrine. German officers were trained to carry detailed instructions so that operations could continue even if communications failed. This decentralization, efficient early in the war, became a liability as retreat became more common. Officers fleeing encirclement often carried maps and attack directives that, if seized, revealed German fallback lines or the boundaries between divisions. During the retreat from Normandy, British and American patrols repeatedly discovered corps-level administrative papers left behind in collapsed command posts. In Italy, German withdrawals up the peninsula were so rushed that entire regional contingency plans, including bridge demolition schedules and rail transport priorities, were found intact in abandoned buildings. On the Eastern Front, where catastrophic losses mounted, German staff officers sometimes buried documents in snow or shallow pits, hoping to return them, but Soviet troops found them first. Each loss chipped away at the illusion of German control. German reports from 1944 show a rising anxiety regarding document security. Commanders lamented that vital intelligence had fallen into Allied hands due to the speed and violence of enemy offensive action. The vulnerability was baked into the structure of their command system. The reliance on written coordination was essential, but the ability to destroy those records during collapse was limited by the conditions of mechanized war. This flaw, once minor, became fatal as fronts broke apart. A quieter angle emerged in how both sides navigated the moral and psychological dimensions of extracting information. Captured papers often came from the pockets of dead soldiers, retrieved in silence by men who knew that the war had already taken its toll before a single sheet was unfolded. Intelligence teams learned to work respectfully, aware that these documents were fragments of lives cut short, diaries mixed with orders, personal notes beside tactical sketches. The boundary between operational necessity and human empathy became difficult to manage. Officers needed the information quickly, sometimes within minutes, to act on new intelligence, yet the retrieval process remained deeply personal, carried out in trenches, ruined farmhouses, and forests still echoing with gunfire. The moral questions extended to interrogation as well. A captured officer might insist that the documents found on his men were outdated or irrelevant, forcing interrogators to weigh the truthfulness of his claims against the evidence on paper. Interrogations were constrained by the laws of war, and while harsh questioning occurred in some armies, most Allied intelligence units relied on psychological insight rather than coercion. They compared statements against the captured documents, searching for inconsistencies that revealed new layers of enemy planning. In many cases, the documents themselves eliminated the need for extended interrogation. Their clarity and precision spoke more loudly than any prisoner could. The moral tension remained constant. Intelligence demanded speed, yet humanity demanded restraint. Soldiers and analysts worked between those demands, performing a task rooted in both urgency and solemn responsibility. Together, these leadership decisions, enemy vulnerabilities, and moral questions shaped the intelligence war as powerfully as any tank or aircraft. The battlefield had become a place where information, once considered secondary to firepower, now carried the weight of life and death. And as 1944 approached, this competition over documents poised the major powers for a series of moments in which entire operations would be exposed, not gradually, but in a single discovery that rewrote the logic of the next battle. By 1944, the race for documents reached a point where individual discoveries no longer influenced small engagements, they redirected entire operations. The clearest examples emerged across three fronts where captured papers exposed plans the enemy believed were fully concealed. In the days following the Normandy landings, as Allied forces pushed inland through a maze of hedgerows and scattered strongpoints, intelligence teams swept through recently abandoned German positions and uncovered a series of battalion and regimental orders that revealed how fragmented the German defense had already become. What struck analysts most was the precision of these documents. The Germans listed fallback lines, reserve routes, and reinforcement schedules planned for a scenario in which the Allies broke through designated points along the bocage. These papers showed not just where the Germans were, but where they intended to be, and this allowed British and American commanders to strike areas the Germans considered temporarily vacant. In several cases, Allied units bypassed strongpoints entirely, moving into planned German regrouping zones before defenders arrived. The momentum this created was subtle but powerful. German commanders assumed their movements were predictable only to themselves, but their own hurried paperwork turned those assumptions into liabilities the Allies could exploit. A similar pattern appeared months earlier in North Africa, during the retreat of the Afrika Korps. At Bidafom in 1941 and again in later stages of the Desert Campaign, Allied forces seized supply tables, fuel projections, and maintenance schedules from abandoned German and Italian vehicles. While isolated discoveries provided short-term advantages, one breakthrough stood above the rest: the capture of a full administrative folder during a stalled Axis convoy movement. Inside were logistics summaries detailing how much fuel Rommel's forces expected to receive in the coming weeks, and from which ports the shipments would arrive. Analysts in Cairo quickly realized that the projections were overly optimistic, and that German armored units were far more strained than their outward maneuvers suggested. British commanders shifted their strategy accordingly, choosing operations that forced the Afrika Korps to expend fuel they could not replace. German maneuver warfare, once fluid and dangerous, slowed into a pattern of reactive movements driven by shortages predicted not through guesswork, but through captured numbers typed on official forms. While Rommel's tactical brilliance kept his forces alive longer than expected, The documents revealed that his supply system could not sustain the pace of his ambitions, and Allied strategy hardened around exploiting that weakness. In the northwestern reaches of the continent, another decisive moment unfolded during the early stages of the Allied breakout from Normandy. As American forces pressed toward St. Lo and British units toward Caen, patrols discovered a bunker housing the remains of a German operations officer killed during an artillery strike. His map case, untouched under rubble, held updated defensive maps for a German corps attempting to coordinate counterattacks along the Caen-Falaise corridor. These maps included the intended positions of anti-tank guns, planned artillery concentrations, and the staging areas for armored reserves that had not yet arrived at the front. The precision was startling. Analysts realized that several German formations were preparing to reposition within a narrow window, leaving certain lines exposed before the movement could be completed. When the information reached Corps and Army Group headquarters, Allied commanders accelerated planned offensives by mere hours. This minor adjustment placed Allied infantry and armor at the right place before fresh German units solidified their defenses, contributing to the eventual collapse of the German line around Caen and opening the path toward Falaise. No single action delivered this outcome, but the captured plans provided the clarity that allowed commanders to turn a difficult stalemate into a widening breach. The Eastern Front offered an even more dramatic case when Soviet forces exploited captured German papers during Operation Bagration in summer 1944. As Red Army units pushed into Belarus, they overran several corps-level command posts whose officers had only minutes to react before withdrawing. In the chaos, burn kits were either forgotten, disabled by shellfire, or insufficient to destroy the volume of material stored inside the headquarters. Soviet intelligence units captured folders containing reinforcement timetables, retreat routes, and assessments of Soviet unit strengths in the sector. Among these papers were detailed engineering notes indicating which bridges German units intended to demolish and which they planned to leave intact for their own movement. The Soviets used this knowledge to anticipate German withdrawals and cut off units attempting to escape eastward. In some cases, Soviet commanders directed artillery fire onto bridges minutes before German engineers reached them. The combination of speed, precision, and timing, driven directly by the captured documents, contributed to one of the most devastating encirclements of the war, as the entire German corps dissolved under attacks calibrated with information they had accidentally surrendered. These moments formed the pattern that defined the decisive stage of the intelligence war. Captured documents no longer shaped only battles, but the tempo and direction of entire campaigns. And as the Allies advanced deeper into France after D-Day, one final discovery would reveal not fragments of enemy intention, but the complete operational design of a German corps still fighting just beyond the next ridge, an intelligence breakthrough that would tilt the balance of the front in an instant. The most decisive discovery came in late June 1944, when Allied units advancing through the dense, uneven terrain south of Bayeux stumbled upon a German corps headquarters, abandoned so abruptly that breakfast dishes still sat on the table. The assault that drove the Germans from the position had been sudden, an artillery barrage followed by an infantry push that breached the perimeter earlier than expected. As British troops secured the compound, intelligence officers were summoned to a half-collapsed building where a steel safe, blown open by the blast, lay on its side. Scattered across the floor were folders stamped with the insignia of the German LXXXIV Corps. Within minutes it became clear that these were not routine papers lost during a retreat. They were the complete operational plans for the corps responsible for countering Allied advances toward Caen and the central sectors of Normandy. The documents included updated orders of battle, precise artillery allocations, reserve locations, and the timing of scheduled counterattacks meant to unfold over the next 48 hours. Analysts who examined the papers described them later as a near-perfect snapshot of German thinking at the exact moment their front was beginning to fracture. Unlike the smaller discoveries made earlier in the campaign, this find reflected the full weight of German intentions, exposing both their confidence in certain positions and their acute anxiety in others. Every assumption, fallback line, and contingency was laid bare. The significance of the documents became apparent within hours as they were rushed to headquarters. Allied commanders, who had been planning their next moves amid uncertainty about German reserves, suddenly held a blueprint of the enemy's hopes and fears. The papers revealed that several German divisions were positioned thinly in sectors the Allies previously believed were heavily defended, while stronger units, including armored reserves, were massed for counterattacks that had not yet begun. Most revealing were reports written by German staff officers predicting where they believed the Allies would push hardest. These predictions were wrong. The Allies now knew the Germans expected major pressure in the eastern sector near Caen, while leaving the central corridor comparatively underdefended. Acting on this intelligence required delicate timing. If the Germans realized the documents had been captured, they would alter their plans immediately. Commanders therefore issued new orders quietly, adjusting artillery barrages, advancing reconnaissance patrols, and shifting armored elements without announcing any change to broader operational patterns. American forces exploited the thinly held central corridor, pushing forward before the Germans could reposition, while British units engaged enemy strongpoints only long enough to hold their attention. The impact was immediate and strategic. The German counterattacks planned for the following day collapsed before they even began. Reserve formations arrived at assembly areas already under Allied artillery fire precisely because the captured documents listed their staging zones. Infantry units moving to reinforce threatened positions marched directly into pre-sighted kill zones, where Allied gunners waited with exact grid references taken from the German folders. Roads the Germans intended to use for rapid redeployment were cut off by swift Allied pushes timed to coincide with the gaps shown in the paperwork. In several instances, Allied units reached critical crossroads hours before German forces expected them to be threatened, causing entire battalions to fall back prematurely, believing they were facing a larger force than actually present. German commanders, unaware that their plans had been compromised, interpreted the Allied movements as signs of overwhelming strength rather than precision based on intelligence. This misinterpretation spread up the chain of command, contributing to a growing sense of disorientation within German headquarters. The belief that the Allies were reading their intentions in real time, though unspoken, began to seep into decision-making, accelerating the collapse of their defensive strategy. The psychological effect on Allied commanders was equally significant. For months, they had grappled with uncertainties about German capabilities and intentions in the difficult terrain of Normandy. Now, with a rare moment of clarity provided by documents captured intact, they could direct operations with confidence rather than caution. The intelligence did not guarantee success, but it removed the fog that had obscured the battlefield since the landings. Every adjustment in the days that followed, artillery placement, armored thrusts, infantry advances, was sharpened by the knowledge that the enemy's assumptions had been exposed. Analysts continued to cross-reference the captured plans with ongoing reconnaissance and signals intelligence, allowing them to detect when the Germans attempted to alter their deployments. Even as the enemy tried to adapt, the initial blow delivered by the loss of their operational binder could not be undone. It had given the Allies a window of opportunity precisely when they needed it most, during the critical phase before the breakout toward the Falaise pocket. As Allied forces tightened their grip on Normandy, the consequences of this single discovery rippled outward. Corps and division commanders used the insights to synchronize their movements, exploit timing windows, and avoid the traps the Germans had prepared. The breakthrough did not occur in one dramatic moment, but through a series of calculated steps, each informed by knowledge the enemy never intended to share. When the German line finally began to crumble in July, many officers later admitted that their failure to protect key documents had accelerated the collapse. And for the Allies, the episode became a defining example of how battlefield intelligence, when captured fully and read quickly, could alter not just a fight but the direction of a campaign. The war in Normandy would continue, but the balance had shifted decisively in the hours after those folders were lifted from the floor of a shattered building. In the days immediately following the breakthrough in Normandy, the consequences of the captured LXXXIV Corps plans unfolded in ways both visible and quietly decisive. Allied commanders who had previously advanced with caution were now able to move with a precision that unsettled the German high command. American divisions pushed through the central corridors marked as weak in the captured documents, encountering resistance that was fierce but disorganized, as German officers attempted to reorient their formations without understanding how deeply their intentions had been exposed. British and Canadian units, informed by the same intelligence, shifted pressure points along the Caen front to disrupt the enemy's timetable for counterattacks, striking moments before German reserves were expected to assemble. The effect created a chain reaction. Positions meant to hold for days collapsed in hours, and German battalions that had been scheduled to reinforce the front found themselves arriving at crossroads already lost. When German reports described the situation as unexpectedly fluid, Allied analysts recognized the phrase as an indirect confirmation that the enemy was struggling to understand why their defensive schemes were unraveling faster than anticipated. Artillery played an especially important role in transforming intelligence into tangible advantage. Because the captured plans listed reserve concentration points and fallback locations, Allied guns were able to target these areas with remarkable accuracy. Several German reserve groups were hit during their initial assembly, hours before they could deploy to the front. On other occasions, Allied units arrived early, sometimes by mere minutes, at key junctions the documents had identified as vital for German counterattack routes. These small advances had profound cumulative effects. A battalion delayed on a single road could cause an entire regiment to lose momentum. A disrupted artillery battery could no longer support infantry holding a critical defensive line. Even when German units tried to adjust, their reaction times lagged behind the speed of Allied exploitation. The intelligence had effectively shifted the rhythm of the battle, allowing the Allies to move inside the decision cycle of their opponents. Casualty reports from the period reflected this shift. Allied losses remained heavy, but the ratio tilted subtly in their favor as they avoided several strongpoints the Germans believed would become the focus of Allied assaults. Instead of frontal attacks, Allied commanders used the captured plans to maneuver around reinforced lines and strike sectors whose defenses were incomplete or undermanned. German divisions, already stretched thin by attrition and supply shortages, found themselves unable to re-establish cohesive fronts. Units meant to act as mobile reserves were drawn prematurely into firefights, weakening their ability to respond when the true Allied thrusts began. Logistics officers on the German side reported growing confusion as transport routes supposedly protected by terrain or distance came under sudden Allied scrutiny. Fuel depots, artillery parks, and supply nodes listed in the captured documents were hit with accuracy that made retreating staff officers question whether their lines had been infiltrated. Meanwhile, Allied field headquarters experienced an unusual clarity rarely seen in warfare. For once, their assumptions aligned precisely with the enemy's own planning documents. This allowed staff officers to streamline their recommendations, reducing the uncertainty that normally shaped decisions in complex operations. Signal intelligence, reconnaissance flights, and prisoner interrogations were all cross-referenced against the captured binder, forming an analytical picture that was tighter and more coherent than anything produced in the first chaotic weeks after D-Day. Commanders at every level, from corps down to battalion, felt the shift. Unit diaries from the period describe a growing sense that operations were clicking into place, not because resistance had vanished, but because the fog that clouded the battlefield had briefly lifted. Every movement, every adjustment, every calculated risk held more confidence because it was supported by an enemy blueprint the Germans never intended to surrender. These short-term consequences, amplified across dozens of decisions and hundreds of miles, created a cumulative pressure that the German defense could not withstand. And as July advanced, the effects of this intelligence coup continued to ripple outward, shaping not just local engagements but the broader path of the Allied advance across Normandy. The long-term consequences of the captured LXXXIV core documents extended far beyond the immediate gains of the Normandy campaign, shaping strategic thinking and intelligence doctrine for decades after the war. As the Allied advance pushed deeper into France during July and August 1944, the effects of that single intelligence breakthrough continued to echo through every level of command. German forces, already reeling from weeks of attrition, found themselves increasingly unable to compensate for the initial losses inflicted by Allied exploitation of their exposed plans. The disruption of reserve movements and the early targeting of key logistic nodes created shortages that compounded with each passing day. Divisions that might have stabilized critical sectors arrived too late or under strength, weakening the cohesion of the entire corps. When the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the major breakout from the Bocage, German unit diaries reveal a striking sense of disorientation. Commanders struggled to decipher Allied intentions because their own carefully constructed assumptions had collapsed weeks earlier under the weight of the lost operational binder. As the front widened and German resistance shifted from structured defense to improvised holding actions, Allied planners continued to integrate insights gleaned from the captured documents into broader operational patterns. They could predict, with unusual confidence, which sectors German commanders regarded as essential because the binder had revealed the defensive logic behind their deployment choices. This helped Allied staff anticipate the likely direction of German withdrawals, enabling them to cut off retreating units and block escape routes before German formations could regroup. The eventual encirclement at the Falaise pocket, where tens of thousands of German troops were trapped, owed its shape partly to the superior understanding Allied commanders gained from earlier intelligence discoveries. While many variables contributed to the encirclement, the psychological and organizational damage inflicted by the exposed plans played a significant role. The German High Command, struggling to rebuild its understanding of Allied intentions, misread several developments and repositioned forces based on outdated assumptions, deepening the crisis. Beyond the battlefield, the intelligence coup influenced post-war doctrine across multiple nations. The British, who had already built a strong tradition of disciplined document handling, used the Normandy example to emphasize strict procedures for destruction protocols, secure transport, and compartmentalization of information. The Americans, who expanded dramatically during the war, recognized the need for specialized intelligence units trained not only to interpret captured materials, but to retrieve them safely under combat conditions. The Soviets, familiar with the scale of document losses on the Eastern Front, introduced more rigorous systems for dispersing sensitive materials across multiple command posts, reducing the risk that a single capture could reveal an entire operational plan. These reforms reflected a shared lesson. In industrialized, fast-paced warfare, information could be as lethal as artillery, and failure to protect it could unravel months of planning. The episode also changed the way militaries approached deception and counterintelligence. The Germans had assumed their paperwork would remain secure long enough for operations to unfold. Normandy proved that assumption dangerously optimistic. Allied analysts studying German failures concluded that armies must not only protect documents, but also prepare for the likelihood that some would be captured. This insight shaped Cold War-era planning, where false documents, controlled leaks, and decoy folders became tools of deception, not merely to mislead the enemy but to preemptively exploit the inevitability of battlefield chaos. The idea that a single case of papers could change the course of a campaign became embedded in military culture, influencing training, operational design, and the development of secure communication systems. In the years after the war, historians examining the Normandy campaign repeatedly returned to the moment those folders were found on the floor of a shattered headquarters. While the discovery alone did not decisively win the campaign, its impact resonated across engagements, shaping decisions that magnified Allied strengths and exposed German vulnerabilities. It demonstrated that the fate of armies could hinge not only on courage or firepower, but on the fragile chain of assumptions written in ink. The loss of those documents weakened the German ability to fight coherently, accelerated the Allied advance, and became a lasting reminder of how easily the architecture of war could collapse when its secrets were left behind. And as post-war militaries studied the lessons of Normandy, they found that the story of those plans was not merely a historical incident, but a warning etched into the foundations of modern warfare. When historians look back at the summer of 1944, they often focus on the armored thrusts, the liberation of towns, and the collapse of German lines across Normandy. Yet beneath the smoke and movement, the quiet discovery of a binder on a dusty headquarters floor shaped the course of events in ways that maps and monuments rarely capture. War is often imagined as a contest of strength, but the Normandy campaign revealed a deeper truth, that entire armies move according to plans written by a handful of men, and that the loss of those plans can unravel confidence as surely as a breach in the line. The captured documents from LXXXIV Corps did not create victory on their own, but they illuminated the battlefield at a moment when clarity mattered most. They allowed commanders to see beyond the hedgerows, beyond the uncertainty of enemy intentions, and into the fragile architecture of a defense already strained by exhaustion and shortages. The papers showed not just movements and timings, but fears and expectations, the assumptions upon which the German command had built its hopes of slowing the Allied advance. And once exposed, those assumptions could no longer hold. Long after the fighting in Normandy ended, veterans remembered the odd stillness of command posts where documents were found, the overturned chairs, the cold stoves, the abandoned cups, the silence that followed chaos. These scenes revealed the human side of war's planning, the vulnerability of systems that depend on perfect order in a world defined by disorder. The war taught militaries that information could shift the path of history as decisively as any weapon, and that safeguarding it demanded discipline equal to fighting in the field. Modern armies, shaped by these lessons, design their operations with an acute awareness of what a single lost folder can cost. And in the quiet halls of military academies where young officers study the Normandy campaign, the story endures. That on a morning in June 1944, victory tilted not only because of tanks or aircraft, but because the truth of an enemy plan lay open under the dust of a shattered room. waiting for someone to pick it up and read it.